I turned 24 last spring. A year before that, on the day most people expect cake and quiet congratulations, I stood on the edge of a concrete driveway holding a single suitcase and a locked-out bank app. The sky was blue, the kind of indifferent blue that doesn't match the chaos of personal collapse. My name is Lauren. I had been living in the west suburbs of Chicago, tucked inside a house with plantation shutters and motion-triggered porch lights. From the outside, it looked serene, symmetrical flower beds, a leased luxury sedan, a brass plaque on the mailbox engraved with Harrington. Inside, precision ruled everything. There was no mess, no clutter, no deviation. My stepfather, Thomas Harrington, ran the regional division of a major bank. He gave guest lectures at community colleges about financial literacy and loved quoting behavioral economics in casual conversation. To his peers, he was thoughtful and principled, a mentor. To me, he was a strategist who managed affection like a portfolio, every gesture measured against risk. Evelyn, my mother, had a background in interior design and a specialty in reputational maintenance. She spoke in polished tones, often smiling with her eyes more than her mouth. Within our home, she itemized every household expenditure, tracking my laundry detergent and contact lenses as if they were line items on an overdue invoice. I wasn't thrown out in anger. There were no raised voices, just documents, printed and stapled. A checklist with items labelled discontinued. That morning, I still had my university ID in my wallet and a travel mug from the office where I interned twice a week. By evening, I had become something else entirely. They called it independence. But they never asked what it meant to me. I didn't fall apart the way they probably expected. The silence they offered me on my birthday wasn't followed by pleas or hysterics. There was no begging. I moved the suitcase into the back seat of my car and drove away without checking the rearview mirror. The house remained still, behind me, its trimmed hedges and porcelain planters betraying nothing. I stayed that first night on the vinyl couch in Harper's apartment, a girl I hadn't spoken to since sophomore year, but who responded to my text within 2 minutes. She worked night shifts at the trauma ward of a hospital near Lincoln Park. Her place smelled faintly of antiseptic and microwaved soup, and her presence was mostly theoretical. I became a temporary shadow in a space that didn't belong to me. By day, I picked up extra shifts at the used bookstore on Belmont where I'd worked weekends. They didn't ask questions. I shelved donations, reorganized the poetry section, and took my breaks in silence, drinking bitter coffee from a chipped ceramic mug with someone else's name etched on it. I began hoarding cash, not in any dramatic sense, but with quiet precision. Every tip, every commission from rare book sales, every refund I processed into store credit, I counted it twice. I never touched the joint accounts again. They were still there, visible in the app. But I treated them like fossils, remnants of a system I no longer had faith in. Instead, I opened a new checking account under my own name, linked to nothing, named for no one. It wasn't much, but it was clean. They hadn't expected me to go silent. Thomas, in particular, must have imagined I would email within days requesting reconsideration or assistance. Instead, I filed every text, every warning, every clause he'd sent into a folder labelled proof. Evelyn didn't reach out. She never did. Her strategy was always absence, a soft punishment. The apartment grew cold at night. Harper's building had radiator heat that sputtered in intervals, like a machine trying to cough up regret. I slept in layers, hoodie over long sleeves, socks under socks. Some mornings I'd wake with one arm numb and the other still holding my phone, open to job listings or financial aid forms I never submitted. I started visiting the Roosevelt University Library, not for classes. I'd already graduated, but for internet access and quiet. I used their public terminals to research legal boundaries. What defined unauthorized access? What protections existed for shared data? I took notes in a composition book that still had my mother's handwriting on the front cover. Lauren, junior year. She used to label everything. Back in high school, Thomas had insisted I manage all their digital banking transitions. Evelyn said technology gave her headaches. I had created their online profiles, chosen their passwords, linked recovery emails. I still remembered the first ones, City of God 1972 and Midpoint Bridge 19 Hap. Back then, I thought it was a sign of trust. Now I understood it as a kind of delegation, offloading tasks to avoid responsibility. They had never changed those passwords. Or if they had, they'd only altered them slightly, changing a number or punctuation mark. They used the same recovery email, the same phone number. They still assumed I wouldn't know how things worked. It never occurred to them I might have paid attention. Each time Thomas scolded me for what he called unsustainable purchasing behavior, I remembered the spreadsheet I once found open on his laptop, his own spending categories buried under euphemisms: external consulting, apparel rotation, motivational dining. I remembered the way he double-clicked the same security certificate to check his balance, never questioning whether he should learn more about how it all functioned. It would have been easy to extract money. That wasn't the point. I wasn't interested in theft. I was interested in imbalance, correcting it. And so I waited. I didn't tell Harper anything. She had enough to carry between double shifts and fractured sleep. I kept my notes to myself. I called it documentation, not a plan, not yet. I started compiling timelines when their mortgage payments posted, when their club membership fees renewed, when Evelyn's favourite boutique ran its seasonal pre-orders. I traced the rhythm of their life like a pattern of tides. On the first Tuesday of every month, the SUV lease payment cleared. On Thursdays, Evelyn's groceries were delivered at precisely 9:45 a.m. I knew their spending habits more intimately than I'd ever known their values. On weekends, I'd sit in the corner booth of a cafe that offered free Wi-Fi and refillable coffee. The baristas never minded. I always tipped in cash. I brought my old laptop, the one Thomas claimed was a graduation investment. It still had the banking bookmarks he once asked me to install. I never used them. I just liked knowing they were there. Through online forums and cybersecurity blogs, I learned the nuances of credit locks, identity verification loopholes, and dispute triggers. All publicly available information, all designed to protect users from external threats, not internal ones. I wasn't bypassing the system, I was walking through the doors they left unlocked. I stored everything in an encrypted folder, one labelled not with their names but with a date, February 28th, the last day of the month. No particular meaning on its own, but it sat between the routine and the expected, the kind of date that slipped by unnoticed until it didn't. I kept working, I kept saving. Harper got a promotion, I found another side job, dog-sitting for a professor in Hyde Park. I stayed quiet. If they felt the absence of my voice, they didn't say so. If they were watching, they never let it show, but I watched. I always had. I stopped responding altogether. No explanations, no rebuttals, no acknowledgement. Messages accumulated in my inbox and phone. Some short, some rhetorical, all carefully worded to imply concern while reinforcing control. I left them unread. It wasn't anger that drove my silence. It was containment, precision, a kind of emotional fasting. Thomas sent multiple requests for what he called shared property, referencing the laptop he had once ceremonially handed to me during a dinner at the university club. Evelyn's message was more abstract, written like a note passed between corporate executives, phrases about long-term development, misunderstood intentions, and legacy. I gave both messages the same treatment. Archive without reply. I let myself become unreadable. I didn't post on social media. I didn't appear at familiar coffee shops. I didn't inquire about family gatherings or mutual contacts. The version of me they had access to was no longer current. It wasn't a disappearance exactly, more like version control. I became a draft saved under another file name. Their confidence returned quickly. I could sense it in the passive tone of their final email, legal in nature, devoid of warmth, marked sent from mobile. There was an assumption embedded in it that this was finished, that I had gone wherever the disobedient go when they realise they've lost. Their quiet, reinforced mine confirming what I suspected. When nothing challenged their rhythm, they stopped anticipating disruption. Meanwhile, I spent 2 afternoons each week in the Student Legal Resource Centre, tucked behind the main administrative building at Roosevelt. The walls were plastered with pamphlets about tenant rights, consumer protections, and credit restoration after identity theft. I wasn't there out of panic. I was there for fluency. I wanted to understand how systems responded when challenged just below the threshold of violation. The first thing I learned was that financial dependence does not equal legal dependency. I was no longer eligible to be claimed under anyone's tax filings, and there was no formal documentation tying me to their household. My enrollment records, lease history, and income statements positioned me as an autonomous adult, even if my history told another story. That was useful. I read through statutes about eviction protocols. In Illinois, even informal occupants, those without written lease agreements, are entitled to notice, 30 days minimum. Anything less is considered unlawful removal. I printed those pages and folded them into a manila folder I kept at the bottom of my backpack, beneath blank job applications and a city transit map. I signed up for a data security seminar hosted by a local non-profit. The event was held in the community room of a public library, the kind that smelled faintly of old paper and hand sanitizer. The presentation was dry but informative. Most of the attendees were over 50. I took notes discreetly and left before the Q&A session began. Back at Harper's, I became meticulous. I backed up every file, encrypted personal documents, installed system monitors on all devices. I moved my password manager to a USB key and kept it in a pocket-sized safe I purchased second-hand from a closing office supply store. I learned how to verify logins without triggering alerts and how to request copies of consumer credit files without generating soft inquiries. I subscribed to newsletters I never read and joined online forums under an alias that mirrored no part of my identity. I adjusted screen brightness levels to reduce eye strain during late-night sessions. I scanned headlines about financial fraud, not for tactics, but for language. I was studying tone, pattern, response. My daily routines flattened out. I woke early, walked to the bookstore, clocked in, filed invoices, stocked shelves. I ate the same meals, wore the same pair of boots, folded my laundry on Sunday nights while listening to instrumental jazz playlists curated for concentration. Nothing in my schedule suggested improvisation. Harper didn't question my quietness. She moved through the apartment like a ghost, working double shifts, pausing long enough to microwave frozen vegetables and repack her overnight bag. We passed like commuters in a transfer station, aware of each other, but untethered. It worked. She gave me space, and I didn't burden her with context. The snow that winter was minimal, but the cold was consistent. I walked with my hands tucked into my coat sleeves and kept my gaze low. I made eye contact less. I answered questions with fewer words. I let voicemail take calls. My presence reduced to function, not flair. Occasionally I would log into the old account interface, not to interact, just to confirm. Everything remained as I had left it, the access points, the credentials, the familiar oversight. It felt like standing in an empty theatre long after the show ended, hearing only the echo of past performances. I began collecting dates, not birthdays or holidays. Those meant little now. Instead, I tracked transaction schedules, invoice cycles, recurring fees, statement postings. I noted what was automatic and what required human input. I looked for pressure points, moments when systems demanded activity, verification, or payment. Each date I marked had no label, just a circle on a blank calendar. But I memorized the sequence. One red dot was always followed by two blue ones. Another was marked with an asterisk just in case. The manila folder grew thicker. Inside it were printouts, handwritten timelines, snippets of regulations and sections of user agreements I highlighted in pencil. I added a small envelope with 3 names and phone numbers of professionals whose services I might need eventually but didn't contact yet. Not yet. At night, I sometimes sat with the lights off, letting the refrigerator hum its low, mechanical rhythm. There was something calming about the predictability of machinery. Unlike people, machines responded only to code and sequence, no interpretation, no performance. I watched less television. I stopped listening to music with lyrics. I preferred white noise or silence. When I slept, it was without dreams, or if I dreamed, I didn't remember. People who noticed the shift attributed it to hardship. That was fine. It gave them something to believe, something comfortable. No one suspected preparation. Preparation isn't loud. It's quiet, disciplined. It lives in the pauses, in the absence. By February, I had stopped checking the weather. There was no need. I knew what was coming. The air that morning held a strange clarity, cold, dry, edged with stillness. I made coffee in Harper's kitchen without sound, the drip of the machine the only punctuation in the hour. The windows had fogged at the corners. I wore gloves indoors, not because I needed to, but because it gave my hands something to do. February 27th passed without fanfare. No appointments, no shifts. I had marked it weeks ago on my private calendar, unlabelled but underscored. The cafe where I usually worked on Saturdays had closed temporarily for renovations, which meant fewer eyes, less noise. I used a borrowed laptop connected only through a public VPN tunnel. The login interface hadn't changed in 2 years. Familiar, nearly nostalgic. The same navy banner, the same warning not to share credentials. I followed every protocol I had designed for others. 2-factor authentication arrived in the inbox I had once set up for Evelyn. Security questions popped up one after another, soft echoes of a life that had once been collaborative. Instead of altering account details, I submitted alerts. Routine, protective, ordinary. I enabled fraud monitoring across all 3 major credit bureaus, flagged high-risk activity, and placed freezes that required phone-based verification. No deletions. No false entries, just reconfiguration. A tightening of access. The answers to security questions were altered minutely. A misplaced capital here, a substituted number there. The effect was immediate, but invisible. Each change was enough to cause failure during reauthentication, but subtle enough to appear like user error. There was no damage, nothing irreversible, only interruption. Once the final freeze was confirmed, I closed the session. I cleared browser history, powered down and walked 2 blocks in the opposite direction before tossing the disposable USB into a public trash bin. I arrived home before dusk. Harper was already asleep between shifts. The apartment smelled faintly of detergent and artificial lemon. I didn't celebrate. I swept the kitchen floor, replied to unread job emails, folded laundry. The following day, I went to work as usual. The store was quiet, the customers predictable. I restocked shelves, updated inventory logs, and left a note for my manager about requesting Wednesdays off. Nothing in my demeanour suggested movement. But movement had begun. By March 1st, the surface began to crack. My cousin Madison sent a screenshot from a family group chat. Evelyn had posted a vague update about technical disruptions and advised relatives to call rather than text. There was mention of the bank, of a freeze, of needing to verify charges. I received it while shelving psychology books. That evening, Thomas's professional website displayed a maintenance banner. The scheduling page for new consultations was offline. His assistant's LinkedIn activity spiked. Endorsements, resume updates, passive signals of instability. The timing aligned with payroll cycles. A friend from the university, still connected to Evelyn through a non-profit board, mentioned in passing that she had cancelled her appearance at a community event citing unexpected complications. No details were offered. None needed. The real signal came the following week. A client of Thomas's firm posted a complaint on a local financial forum about an unanswered billing issue. It didn't name him directly, but referenced a long-trusted advisor suddenly unreachable. Comments accumulated beneath it. Other names appeared. Dots began to connect. Then came the public-facing breakdowns. Evelyn's card declined at a boutique she frequented. She had to step outside to make a phone call while the clerk waited with an unfinished receipt. Someone from the store posted about it anonymously on a neighborhood message board. Descriptions matched. Timing matched. The speculation spread quickly. Thomas, too, faced turbulence. A payment failed during a client lunch. The restaurant, one with table linens and reservation-only seating, required another guest to cover the bill. There were witnesses. One of them posted a vague tweet. It was picked up, reshared, and eventually made its way to one of those suburban gossip blogs that masquerade as lifestyle sites. Through it all, I said nothing. I posted nothing. I didn't search my name. I didn't open news alerts. I let the course unfold with its own momentum. Silence became both shield and weapon. At work, I continued sorting donations. A man brought in a crate of old philosophy texts, and I spent the afternoon categorizing Kant, Kierkegaard, and a battered copy of Being and Time. There was something grounding in physical books. They aged in plain view. On March 4th, another signal came. A charge from the country club was declined. This one I confirmed, not from rumour, but from an auto-generated notification tied to one of the consumer alerts still pinging my encrypted inbox. No detail. Just a timestamp, a status, a silent acknowledgement of interruption. Evelyn rescheduled her salon appointment. Thomas missed a speaking engagement. Their LinkedIn activity froze entirely. Where once they had curated updates, charity involvement, keynote announcements, lifestyle photographs, there was now digital stasis. Their credit profile, as far as public data allowed, had entered triage. All activity ceased. The system treated them as compromised, requiring manual verification for all interactions. It was protection, the kind designed to prevent misuse. The irony, if it existed, didn't interest me. I wasn't invested in symmetry, not for drama, but for pattern recognition. The ripples, not the splash. Harper noticed the change only in my posture. I moved differently, not taller or prouder, just steadier. My routine didn't shift, my voice didn't rise, but the edges of me had settled into form. I returned library books on time. I submitted 2 more job applications. I declined a social invitation without apology. The world didn't know what had happened. The world didn't need to. The system had been nudged, not broken, corrected, or perhaps simply reminded that equilibrium has its own quiet force. I lit a candle one night, not for reflection but for clarity. The flame didn't flicker. I sat beside it, unmoved. The machine was already in motion. The weeks that followed were quiet in a different way. Not the silence of withdrawal or uncertainty, but the quiet that comes after a shift. An atmospheric change you don't notice until your body reacts before your mind can. The air felt heavier, not oppressive, just full. I began sleeping again. Not deeply, but enough. Dreams returned in fragmented shapes. I no longer woke up scanning for alerts or instinctively reaching for the charging phone by the mattress. The notifications still came, but I stopped checking them. The system I had built to observe their unraveling was no longer necessary. It continued on its own like a machine coasting on residual power. Whispers moved through the circles they once curated. Former colleagues of Thomas, women from Evelyn's charity boards, alumni connections. They began to fill in blanks. Nobody said the word failure. That would have been impolite. Instead, they framed the situation as unexpected, unfortunate, temporary. A former neighbour sent a message through a mutual acquaintance, asking if I had heard anything about what was happening. There was no malice in the question, only curiosity dressed as concern. I didn't respond, not because I held resentment, but because I no longer owed anyone that version of the story. At the bookstore, I was offered a new responsibility, an informal promotion of sorts. Cataloguing rare donations, researching provenance, writing blurbs for collector newsletters. It wasn't much in terms of money, but it was trust, the kind that had nothing to do with family name or performance metrics. The manager noted that I was reliable, that I paid attention, that I didn't create noise. I nodded and said thank you. That was enough. My name began to circulate in other ways. A friend from university connected me to someone running an internship program for digital design students. They were looking for someone with research skills, strong organization, and discretion. No promise, just a conversation. I prepared my portfolio in silence. The pieces were simple, mostly layout work and typographic studies, but they were mine, not commissioned, not edited for approval. At the interview, the director asked me about a gap in my resume. I said I had taken time to reassess priorities. She didn't press further. Perhaps she understood. Or perhaps she recognized the clarity in my tone. Either way, 2 days later I received an offer. Modest stipend. 3 months. A chance to build something new. Harper started leaving me notes. Not long ones. Reminders about shared groceries, thanks for washing dishes, suggestions for local bakeries. Her handwriting was small, structured, almost architectural. I replied with post-its on the fridge, clipped receipts, a box of tea she mentioned once while half asleep. We didn't become friends exactly, but something adjacent formed. In the legal aid centre, a counsellor asked if I would consider sharing my experience in a confidential training session for staff. They were developing case studies for better supporting students who had experienced informal eviction or financial manipulation. My name wouldn't be used. I said I'd think about it. I did. Spring edged in slowly. The daylight lingered longer, and the trees on Roosevelt's campus began to bud. I walked the paths I had once crossed in different shoes, carrying different burdens. My pace was slower now. I didn't rush between destinations. I attended a portfolio review hosted by the university's design department. I submitted 2 pieces anonymously. They were both selected for the student showcase. No prizes, no announcements. But during the event, A local gallery owner asked about the creator of one of the submissions. My professor mentioned my name. A follow-up email arrived 3 days later, asking if I would consider submitting a series for their summer exhibit. I reread it 3 times before replying. The evening after that email, I passed by the building where I'd once met Thomas for coffee. He used to take calls on the terrace, his voice measured, persuasive. I didn't stop walking. I didn't look for him. It no longer mattered if he was still there. I started using a new notebook. The old one, with the timelines and legal notes, was sealed in a folder and placed in the back of the closet. Not thrown away, just archived. Its presence was no longer required in my daily orbit. One night, Harper left a takeout container on the table for me, some dish from a Mediterranean place downtown. Inside was a small card from the restaurant, handwritten, thanking the customer for supporting a local family business. The handwriting was different from hers. I didn't ask, but I kept the card. I began tutoring a younger student in digital media. She struggled with formatting, deadlines, and self-doubt. I showed her shortcuts in Illustrator, tips for managing layers, how to name files cleanly. She asked if design was worth it. I told her it depends who's asking. At the gallery orientation, the curator offered me a small workspace for a month. Not a studio, just a desk near a window where I could sketch or review concepts. I accepted. I arrived early and stayed late. I didn't bring music. I let the city fill the silence. From time to time, I received updates from mutual connections about Thomas and Evelyn. The situation had stabilized. The systems were recovering. No lasting damage, no lawsuits. They had returned to their routines, albeit slightly altered. Evelyn had taken a step back from some committees. Thomas had restructured his consultancy. They were rebuilding, or at least repositioning. They still didn't know, or if they suspected, they never said. I never corrected them. I never needed to. There was nothing left to confess. By early April, I stopped measuring progress against their collapse. My goals had shifted. I tracked my days in hours worked, files submitted, meals cooked. I calculated my budget in columns of essentials and extras. I found satisfaction in balance sheets that didn't include resentment. I no longer needed the story to bend in my favour. It had already turned, quietly, fully, and without their permission. The invitation came printed on textured cream cardstock, slipped inside a thin envelope without return address. At first glance, I thought it was another fundraising gala or alumni update. But it was from the university, Roosevelt, requesting my presence as a guest speaker at their spring seminar on financial independence and postgraduate transition. They wanted someone who had navigated early career setbacks, someone who had rebuilt without inherited privilege. I read the letter twice before setting it aside, not because I didn't want to accept, but because something in me needed time to understand what it meant. To be asked, not assigned. To be seen, not examined. The event was scheduled for late May. By then, Minneapolis had thawed. The sidewalks were scattered with cherry blossoms and flyers for open mic nights. The apartment I shared with Janice and Ray had turned into something resembling home. We had fallen into easy rhythms, alternating groceries, quiet nights, stories traded across mugs of tea. They never asked for details, but they understood certain silences. We were 3 women on parallel recoveries, each rebuilding something we'd been told we couldn't manage alone. There was no hierarchy in the apartment, only acknowledgement, respect without the need for proof. The startup I interned at had extended an offer, junior UX researcher. Not glamorous, but steady. The hours were long, but my designs were being used. Real clients, real feedback. The first time I saw a wireframe I created integrated into a functioning interface. I didn't tell anyone, I just sat with it for a while. Quiet pride doesn't need audience. I returned to Chicago for the seminar alone. The university had offered to cover expenses, but I declined. It felt right to make the journey on my own terms. The train ride was uneventful. I brought a book but didn't read it. The motion was enough. The auditorium was smaller than I remembered. Fewer seats, less imposing. Time has a way of shrinking what once felt immense. I sat backstage for a few minutes before my name was introduced, not as a victim, not as a warning, but as someone with experience and insight. Words that for a long time I hadn't allowed myself. I didn't give a speech. I told a story, not all of it, just the shape, the outline of control, the price of silence, the work of detaching without bitterness. I talked about systems, personal and institutional, and how they fail, and how sometimes you have to fail with them before building something better. No one applauded during. They listened, eyes focused, hands still. When it ended, there were questions, not about the who, but about the how, not about revenge, but about recovery. And afterward, one student approached with a notebook in hand. She had underlined a sentence I barely remembered saying. The hardest part isn't starting over, it's believing you can define the terms. That night, back in my room at a modest hotel 2 blocks from campus, I sat by the window with the city spread beneath me and thought about how far I had come. Not geographically, but internally. I wasn't trying to win anymore. I wasn't proving anything. I was just continuing. The next morning, I received a message from the gallery in Minneapolis. They had finalized their summer lineup and asked if I'd like to include 3 of my pieces. No pressure, just an invitation. I accepted. I no longer measured value by who recognized it, but being asked still meant something. Evelyn had messaged again a few weeks prior, something vague, something familiar. I responded with courtesy and finality. No open door, no cruelty, just distance shaped by clarity. It wasn't about cutting ties. It was about not stitching them back for the sake of comfort. There are people who will never understand the harm they caused, but healing doesn't wait for their apology. It happens in the everyday acts of claiming space, of choosing differently, of building something no one can take back. We don't always get closure. Sometimes we get continuity, and sometimes that's enough. Some stories don't end with applause. They end in quiet clarity, in moments when you realize you've stopped waiting for someone else to define your worth. I didn't set out to prove anything. Not to them, not even to myself. I simply wanted space to exist without being measured against expectations I never agreed to. In the end, what shifted everything wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a sudden victory. It was the accumulation of small, deliberate choices. Boundaries drawn silently, trust rebuilt carefully, a life pieced together on my terms. There are many forms of justice. Some come through courts and policies. Others arrive as invitations, acknowledgements, or simply the absence of fear. For me, justice looked like stability, like being asked to share, not justify, like waking up without scanning for threat. Perhaps you've been in a place like that, pushed aside, underestimated, written off by people who claim to know what's best for you. And perhaps, like me, you've learned that reclaiming your story doesn't always mean shouting it. Sometimes it just means continuing it. So here's what I wonder. What does fairness look like when no one is watching? And who are you when you no longer need to explain your presence? If this story reminded you of your own or someone else's, I hope you carry that with you, quietly, proudly, and on your own terms.